The sun rose lazily over the village, casting long, golden rays across the savanna. In the heart of this serene landscape stood a towering baobab tree, its wide branches sprawling like a wise elder embracing the land. Around it, life bustled with a rhythm as old as time. Children chased each other with laughter, mothers balanced baskets of yams on their heads, and fathers worked tirelessly in the fields. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted maize and the earthy scent of the land. At the edge of the village sat Kamau, a boy of 13 years, whose frame spoke of hunger, but whose eyes burned with resilience. He crouched near the dry stream bed, searching for wild roots. His fingers were calloused, his clothes threadbare, but his heart was anchored by the words of his late grandmother. No matter how empty your stomach, Kamau, never let your spirit be empty of truth. Kamau had no family left. His mother had been taken by illness, his father lost to the dangers of hunting lions. The villagers helped him when they could, but even their resources were scarce. Despite his struggles, Kamau remained steadfast. Every evening, as the elders gathered beneath the baobab tree to share stories, Kamau sat close, absorbing their wisdom like rain on parched soil. That evening, the village elder, Baba Olufemi, began his tale as the orange glow of the fire danced on his weathered face. Long ago, Baba Olufemi's voice rumbled like distant thunder. There was a man who found treasure where it did not belong. He took it, thinking wealth would bring him joy. But instead, his shadow grew long and heavy, for what is stolen brings no peace. The gathered children listened with wide eyes, and the adults nodded solemnly. Kamau sat in his usual spot, knees hugged to his chest, his stomach growling softly. Yet he listened intently, his heart stirred by the elders' words. After the story ended, the villagers dispersed, leaving Kamau alone beneath the stars. He gazed at the baobab tree, its silhouette towering against the night sky. "Grandmother," he whispered to himself, "is it true that a man can lose his soul to greed?" The next morning, as Kamau searched for roots near the tree's base, his fingers struck something smooth and cold. He dug deeper and uncovered a worn leather satchel. The weight surprised him, and his curiosity burned. Slowly he opened it and gasped. Inside were stacks of foreign bills, crisp and clean, bound tightly in rubber bands. For a moment, the world around him went silent. He stared at the money, his heart pounding like a drumbeat in a sacred ceremony. $3 million. Though Kamau couldn't grasp the exact number, it was wealth beyond his imagination. "This could buy food," he whispered, his voice trembling. "This could fix the roofs of the huts. This could—" He stopped. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind, steady and stern. "What belongs to another will only bring you grief." Kamau's hands shook as he closed the satchel, his stomach twisted, not with hunger, but with conflict. He knew the money could change his life, yet he also knew it wasn't his. He hid the satchel beneath the roots of the baobab tree, covering it with earth and dry leaves, but the weight of the secret settled on his small shoulders like a burden too great to bear. As days passed, Kamau avoided the tree, yet his thoughts lingered on the satchel. At night, hunger gnawed at him, and dreams of a feast haunted his sleep. By day, he replayed his grandmother's words in his mind. He watched the villagers go about their routines, unaware of the fortune hidden in their midst. But Kamau felt the strain of the secret growing heavier. The philosophy of Ubuntu was the lifeblood of the village. I am because we are. Every action rippled through the community. Kamau knew this truth deeply, yet the satchel's presence threatened to sever that bond. In the shadows of the evening fires, whispers began to creep through the village. Someone had seen Kamau near the baobab tree for longer than usual. Rumors took root, growing wild and tangled. Kamau prostrated, his head propped up against the bough. "Where does the boy sit alone so often?" one woman asked. "What could he be hiding?" another murmured. The murmurs spread, and with them came a quiet greed that seeped into the hearts of a few. Baba Olufemi, sensing the change, gathered the villagers once more. "Beware the poison of envy," he warned. "It blinds the eye and rots the soul." Yet, the elder's warning did little to calm the whispers. Unbeknownst to Kamau, his journey had already begun, and his integrity would soon face its greatest test. The sun dipped low over the village, its orange glow casting long shadows across the dusty paths and the towering baobab tree. Kamau sat near the tree's base, his knees hugged to his chest, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The weight of the satchel he had buried only days before pressed on his mind like the midday heat. He had no one else to confide in but Ayo, the only person in the village who had ever treated him like a brother. When he saw Ayo's figure approaching, he stood and waved him over. Ayo arrived, his usual mischievous grin plastered on his face. But it faded as he noticed Kamao's somber expression. "Kamau, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," Ayo said, plopping down beside him. Kamau hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was nearby. His voice dropped to a whisper. "I've found something big." Ayo's interest was piqued immediately. "Big? What do you mean? Did you catch a lion or find gold?" he teased, but Kamau didn't smile. "It's money," Kamau said. "A satchel full of it. I found it buried under the baobab tree." Ayo froze, his eyes widening. "Money? How much money?" he asked, his voice hushed but laced with excitement. "Oh, I don't know," Kamau admitted, shaking his head. "More than I've ever seen. It's enough to fill your arms, Ayo, enough to change everything." Ayo's grin returned, wider now, almost gleeful. "Kamau, do you realize what this means? We're rich, you and me. We can leave this village, go to the city, eat whatever we want, wear the finest clothes, live like kings." Kamau frowned, the weight in his chest growing heavier. "It's not ours, Ayo. Someone buried it here for a reason. My grandmother always said that what belongs to another will only bring sorrow." "Your grandmother isn't here," Ayo retorted, his tone growing sharper. "This is fate, Kamau. The spirits led you to that money for a reason. Why else would you have found it?" Kamau shook his head. "Fate doesn't ask us to take what isn't ours." "I can't keep it. It's wrong." "Wrong?" Ayo scoffed. "What's wrong is us starving while others live in luxury. Do you think anyone would give us this kind of chance if they found it?" "No, Kamau. This is our chance. Don't throw it away." Kamau said nothing, his heart torn between Ayo's tempting words and the wisdom of his late grandmother, which echoed in his mind like the steady beat of a drum. "What belongs to another will bring no peace to your soul," her voice seemed to say. Over the next few days, the secret began to slip from Ayo's lips. At first, he mentioned it casually to a group of boys near the village well, testing their reactions. By the time the sun set that evening, whispers of the satchel had spread to nearly every corner of the village. "Have you heard about Kamau?" one woman whispered as she shelled groundnuts near her hut. "They say he found riches under the baobab tree." "Riches?" another replied, leaning closer. "Why hasn't he shared them with the rest of us? We're all struggling." The whispers turned to suspicion, and suspicion gave way to quiet resentment. The villagers began to watch Kamau closely, their gazes lingering as he walked through the dusty paths. Even those who had once been kind to him now eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and envy. That evening, Baba Olufemi, sensing the unrest, gathered the villagers around the fire. The elder's voice carried a weight that could calm the most restless hearts. "My children," Baba Olufemi began, "I hear whispers in the wind, whispers that carry greed and envy. Let me tell you a story, one that has been passed down from our ancestors." The villagers leaned in, the crackling firelight dancing in their wide eyes. Long ago, a man found a treasure in the forest. Instead of sharing it, he kept it hidden, believing it would bring him joy. But the treasure was cursed. The man grew paranoid, fearing that others would take what he had stolen. His nights were sleepless, his days filled with anxiety, and when he finally succumbed to his greed, he found that the treasure had turned to dust. Baba Olufemi paused, his gaze sweeping over the gathered crowd. "Greed blinds the eye and hardens the heart. Remember, my children, that we are one. What harms one of us harms us all. Beware of letting envy take root, for it will only bring sorrow." Kamau, seated near the back of the crowd, felt the elder's words settle heavily on his shoulders. He knew he could not keep the satchel, but what could he do? Returning it seemed impossible. What if its owner was dangerous? And yet, leaving it buried would not lift the burden from his heart. That night, under the cover of darkness, Kamau made his decision. He would take the satchel to Baba Olufemi, the only person in the village wise enough to know what to do. As he crept toward the baobab tree, the satchel clutched tightly in his arms, he heard a voice call out behind him. "Where are you going with that?" Ayo stepped out from the shadows, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. "I'm taking it to Baba Olutemi," Kamau replied, his voice firm. "He will know how to make this right." "You're a fool," Ayo hissed, stepping closer. "Do you think the elder will reward you?" "No, Kamal. He'll take it for himself and leave you with nothing. You'll be just as poor as before, and this chance will be gone forever." Kamal shook his head. "It's not about reward, Ayo. It's about doing what's right." "What's right?" Ayo spat. "And what about us? What about our dreams? Do you think the world cares about doing what's right? This money is ours now, Kamau. We can take it and leave this place. No one will ever know." Ayo lunged for the satchel, his hands grasping at it desperately. Kamau stumbled back, holding it tightly against his chest. "Ayo, stop!" he cried. "This isn't the way." "You don't deserve this," Ayo shouted, his voice filled with anger and betrayal. "You're just an orphan. What do you know about what's right?" The struggle lasted only moments, but to Kamau, it felt like an eternity. Finally, he pulled free, and Ayo fell to the ground, his breathing heavy, his eyes filled with a mix of shame and fury. "Ayo," Kamau said softly, his voice trembling. "You were my brother." Ayo looked away, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Without another word, Kamau turned and walked toward Baba Olufemi's hut, the satchel heavy in his arms, but his resolve heavier still. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew he could no longer carry this burden alone. The morning sun broke over the savannah, painting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. Kamau stood at the edge of his village, his satchel secured tightly to his chest. The weight of its contents was almost unbearable, not for its physical heft, but for the moral burden it carried. Each step forward felt like a test, his grandmother's voice echoing in his heart. A pure soul carries no stolen weight. The distant town was a place Kamau had only heard about in stories. Merchants and travelers often spoke of its bustling markets, its grand stone buildings, and its people, who lived lives far removed from the simple existence of the village. Now Kamau would see it for himself, but his journey there would not be easy. The path was narrow and winding, bordered by tall grasses that swayed gently in the wind. Birds sang their morning songs, their melodies offering brief comfort to Kamau's restless mind. He whispered a prayer as he walked, asking his ancestors for guidance. "Show me the way," he murmured, "and give me the strength to do what is right." By midday, the savannah stretched endlessly before him. The heat was oppressive, the sun's rays burning his skin as he trudged onward. Kamau stopped briefly under the shade of a lone acacia tree, sipping from a small gourd of water he had brought with him. His hands trembled as he touched the satchel, still doubting his decision. What if I kept it? Would anyone truly know? But as quickly as the thought surfaced, he pushed it away, ashamed. "Adibe, Adibe," his grandmother's voice returned, steady and clear. A heart weighed down by dishonesty cannot soar. As Kamau approached a rocky pass, his nerves began to tingle. The path narrowed between jagged cliffs, casting long shadows that felt unnervingly still. He quickened his pace, hoping to pass through unnoticed. But, as he rounded a bend, his worst fears were realized. 3 men stepped out from behind the rocks, their eyes sharp and their smiles menacing. They were dressed in tattered clothing, their hands calloused and their faces hardened by a life of desperation. "Hey, boy," the tallest of them called out, his voice slick and oily. "What brings you to our part of the world? You look like you're carrying something valuable." Kamau froze, his heart pounding. He clutched the satchel tightly, his mind racing. "It's nothing," he replied, trying to keep his voice calm. "Just roots for my family." The men exchanged glances, their smirks widening. "Roots, you say?" Another sneered, stepping closer. "That satchel looks heavy for roots. Why don't you show us what you're really carrying?" "I can't," Kamau stammered, taking a step back. "It's not for you." The tallest man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the rocks. "Oh, it's for us now, boy. Hand it over, and maybe we'll let you pass." Kamau felt panic rising in his chest. He glanced around, searching for an escape. Then, his grandmother's words came to him again. "A clever mind is stronger than a sharp spear." The rocky path offered little room to maneuver, but Kamau's sharp eyes caught sight of a small crevice in the boulders nearby. He had played near these cliffs as a child and remembered the narrow gap that only a boy his size could squeeze through. Without a second thought, he turned and sprinted toward it. "Get him!" one of the men shouted, and they gave chase, their heavy footsteps pounding the ground behind him. Kamau's feet moved faster than they ever had before. The satchel bounced against his chest, but he held it firmly, determined not to let it fall. As he reached the crevice, he dropped to his knees and scrambled through the gap, the rough stones scraping his arms and legs. The men reached the opening moments later, but it was too narrow for their broad shoulders. "Come out, boy," one of them growled, his voice laced with frustration. "You can't hide in there forever." But Kamau didn't stop. On the other side of the rocks, he broke into a run, the adrenaline pushing him forward. He didn't dare look back until he was far beyond their reach, his breath ragged and his legs trembling. Finally, he collapsed under the shade of a tree, clutching the satchel to his chest. "Thank you, grandmother," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Your wisdom saved me." By the time Kamau reached the town, the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the bustling streets. The noise was overwhelming. Vendors shouted from their stalls, carts rattled over cobblestones, and children laughed and played in the narrow alleys. Kamau's heart raced, not from fear, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of it all. He approached a uniformed officer near the town square, his small frame dwarfed by the man's imposing figure. "Excuse me, sir," Kamau said, his voice trembling but determined. "I found this in my village. I think it belongs to someone." The officer turned to him, his brows furrowing as he looked at the dusty, tired boy holding a worn satchel. He opened it cautiously, and his eyes widened as the stacks of money came into view. "Where did you find this?" the officer asked, his tone a mix of disbelief and suspicion. "Under a tree," Kamau replied. "I didn't take anything. I thought it should be returned." The officer stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "Wait here," he said, and Kamau stood silently as the man disappeared into a nearby building. A short time later, a wealthy businessman arrived, his fine clothes and polished shoes a stark contrast to Kamau's ragged appearance. The officer handed him the satchel, explaining the situation. The businessman opened it and gasped, his expression shifting from relief to astonishment. "You found this and returned it?" he asked, turning to Kamau. "Even though no one would have known if you kept it." Kamau nodded. "It wasn't mine to keep," he said simply. "My grandmother always taught me that taking what doesn't belong to you brings no peace." The businessman knelt before him, his eyes filled with emotion. "You are an extraordinary boy," he said. "Thank you." As a gesture of gratitude, the businessman offered Kamau a reward, a sum of money large enough to change his life. Kamau looked at the crisp bills, his hands trembling as he reached for them. But just as his fingers brushed the envelope, he paused. His grandmother's voice was clear in his mind. A pure heart seeks no reward for doing what is right. "Thank you, sir," Kamau said, his voice steady. "But I cannot accept this. I only did what I knew was right." The businessman blinked, taken aback. "You would refuse this? After all you've done?" Kamau smiled faintly. "Yes, sir. Peace in my heart is all the reward I need. This is the traditional way." The room fell silent. The officers, the businessman, and everyone present looked at Kamau with a mixture of awe and respect. The businessman finally nodded, his expression softening. "You are a rare soul, young man. The world could learn much from you." Kamau left the town as the sun set, its warm glow lighting his path back to the village. The satchel was no longer in his hands, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in days. As he walked, he whispered to the wind, "Grandmother, I hope I have made you proud." The sun hung low on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the bustling town. Kamau stood before the businessman, his head bowed slightly, feeling the weight of both exhaustion and relief. The satchel was no longer in his possession, and yet, for the first time in days, his heart felt light. The businessman, still stunned by Kamau's honesty, looked at the boy with a deep sense of respect. "You've done something remarkable, young man," he said, his voice soft but filled with conviction. "Many would have taken the money and disappeared, but you chose a different path." Kamau met the man's gaze, his expression steady. "It wasn't mine to take," he replied simply. "My grandmother always said that peace in your heart is worth more than gold." The businessman nodded thoughtfully. "You've taught me something today," he said. He paused, glancing at his assistant before continuing. "This satchel, this money, it means nothing compared to the values you've shown. I can't simply let you leave without giving you something in return, but not just money. You deserve more." Kamau frowned slightly, unsure of what the man meant. "Sir, I don't need anything. I only wanted to do what was right." The businessman smiled. "And that is exactly why I must help you. I will see to it that you receive an education. A boy with your character deserves the chance to learn, to grow, and to build a future. And not just for you," he gestured toward his assistant. "We'll also donate resources to your village, books, supplies, maybe even build a school. Your honesty should uplift not just your life, but the lives of those around you." Kamau's eyes widened. "You would do that for my village?" The man chuckled. "For your village, yes, but more importantly, for you. Your actions deserve to ripple outward, young man." When Kamau returned to the village, the people gathered around him, curiosity etched on their faces. Some had heard rumors of his journey, while others had seen him leave with the satchel and wondered if he would return. As Kamau walked through the village, Baba Olufemi approached, his staff tapping the dry earth with each step. "Kamau," the elder said, his deep voice steady and warm. "You have returned." Kamau nodded, his shoulders square. "Yes, Baba. I did what I believed was right. The satchel is no longer with me." The elder studied the boy's face, noting the quiet determination in his eyes. "Tell us, child, what did you learn on this journey?" Kamau took a deep breath, glancing at the gathered villagers. "I learned that doing what is right isn't always easy," he said. "Sometimes it feels heavy, like carrying the satchel across the savannah. But when I gave it back, the weight lifted. It reminded me of what my grandmother always said. What belongs to another will bring no peace to your heart." The villagers murmured among themselves, their suspicion and greed slowly melting away as Kamau spoke. One of the women stepped forward, her expression contrite. "Kamau, we judged you harshly. We thought you were keeping the money for yourself, but we see now that we were wrong." Another voice chimed in. "You have shown us what it means to live by Ubuntu, to put the good of all above your own gain. We are proud of you." Kamau nodded humbly, the words filling him with both pride and a quiet sadness. He knew not all lessons were easy, but this one had changed him. And, he hoped, his village as well. Later that evening, as the village settled into the warm glow of the fire, Kamau saw Ayo sitting alone under the baobab tree. His friend's shoulders were hunched, his head bowed low. Kamau approached quietly, his steps soft on the dry earth. "Ayo," he said, his voice gentle, Ayo flinched at the sound, but he didn't look up. I betrayed you, Kamau, he muttered, his voice thick with shame. I tried to take the satchel. I let greed blind me, and I hurt you. Kamau sat beside him, the tension between them heavy. Yes, you did, Kamau said, his tone even. But you are my friend, Ayo, and I understand why you did it. Ayo finally looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. You should hate me. I don't hate you, Kamau replied. My grandmother taught me that forgiveness is the only way to heal. I forgive you, Ayo, not because you deserve it, but because holding on to anger will only weigh me down. Ayo swallowed hard, his throat tightening with emotion. Thank you, Kamau, he whispered. I don't deserve your kindness, but I will try to be better. You've shown me what it means to be strong. Kamau placed a hand on his friend's shoulder, the gesture simple but powerful. We all make mistakes, Ayo. It's what we learn from them that matters. The next day, the village gathered under the baobab tree, as Baba Olufemi called them to listen. His voice, deep and resonant, carried over the crowd. Today, we celebrate not just Kamau's return, but the lesson he has brought to us all. The elder's eyes swept over the villagers, his gaze steady. Kamau's story is one we must remember. A boy, hungry and alone, found a fortune buried beneath our very soil. He could have kept it. He could have walked away, but he chose honesty. He chose integrity. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. There is an old tale our ancestors told of a boy who stood before a great river. One path led to riches, the other to peace. Kamau, like the boy in the story, chose peace. And because of him, our village will now grow stronger. The villagers nodded, their faces filled with both pride and humility. Kamau sat quietly among them, his heart swelling as he listened to the elder's words. And so, Baba Olufemi continued, we must carry this lesson forward. Let it be told around our fires, shared with our children, and woven into the fabric of who we are. Let Kamau's courage remind us that the strength of one can uplift us all. The changes in the village came slowly but steadily. True to his word, the businessman sent books, supplies, and builders to create a small school near the baobab tree. The villagers worked together to make the project a success, their renewed sense of unity guiding their efforts. Kamau, once seen as a poor orphan, became a symbol of resilience and integrity. He attended the new school, his thirst for knowledge driving him to excel. And though he still carried the memory of his struggles, he now walked with his head held high, knowing he had done what was right. As the years passed, Kamau's story became part of the village's oral tradition, told by elders to children who sat wide-eyed by the fire. It was a tale of honesty, courage, and the power of doing what was right, even when it was difficult. In the end, Kamau's journey was not just his own. It was a reminder that one boy's choice could ripple outward, transforming not just a life, but an entire community.